Ian, you can go ahead.
I can go now? Good. Well, this is an opportunity for me to give back a bit to Steve Rotman. First of all, the formal biography, which I'm going to just highlight a few things. He's a founding partner of Figurr Architects Collectinve, which was, when I knew it, was called Rubin Rotman Associates. Very heavily involved in community projects, which I'll tell you something about. And he's very involved in the community, such as President Habitat for Humanity. I have to tell you, I'm going to then make this a little longer than normal. I met Steve Rotman about 2006 or 7, maybe he knows the date better than I did. I remember we had a lunch one place. I was head of a foundation which was trying to raise we raised $1.2 million eventually to build a respite home for mentally disabled children on the West Island. The first major gift, I have to tell you, came from the Rotary Club of Westmount. Thanks to the club, thanks to Ted Sancton, who was a past president and a member at the time. And it was because of all that that I became a member of the Rotary Club of Westmount several years after this. In any event, when we finished raising the money somewhere 2007 and 8, Steve Rotman became the architect for it. And I'm sure what he spent doing this project was vastly in excess of what we paid him. He did a splendid job. The respite home is a shining star of the services provided by the community for mentally disabled children. It's on Elm Avenue in Beaconsfield, just somewhat west of St. Charles. The project was a huge success, and I'm much indebted to Steve Rotman and his people for the excellent work they did on that. So that's my giving back to Steve and
Thank you.
A heartfelt recommendation. Now, I haven't finished there. In the course of all this, I discovered, and I see even on his bio here, it says that Stephen graduated with a Master of Architecture degree from Washington University of St. Louis. Well, for those of you who don't know Washington University of St. Louis, it is known as the Harvard of the Midwest. My mother, now deceased for some 7-8 years, was a graduate of 1940 of Washington University of St. Louis, which I've told Steve.
Yeah.
So whenever Steve and I have this connection, it's my mother was very proud of her. She grew up, my mother was an American, grew up in St. Louis, and was very proud of her years there. And it was because of her degree there that she eventually met my father. This was during the Second World War, and I'm here today. So there's my introduction. Thank you, Steve, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you. That was actually quite fun. I appreciate it. So thank you all for inviting us for this session on washrooms for all. We are quite honored to be here. Even if it's not in person and it's by Zoom, it's still an honor. We'd like to share some insights on this topic that is revolutionizing the way we think about accessible and inclusive design in our public spaces. In keeping with the Rotary Club's mission, whoops. Oh, I just lost my script.
Oh, sorry, because I'm sharing the screen, sorry.
Yeah. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties as usual. I don't know how that happened.
See if you can minimize your Zoom screen, and then I think that your previous screen
will come back. It'll come back. Okay, so how do I under view? Yeah, okay, it's back. Okay, here we go. In keeping with the Rotary Club's mission as leaders in change and problem solvers who see the world where people unite and take action to create lasting change, we hope you find this topic relevant and interesting. Before we get started, just a little bit about ourselves. My name is Stephen Rotman, as you've heard, and I am a founding partner of Figurr Architects Collective. We have offices in Montreal and Ottawa. We have about 45 people in all working with us. I've worked on many complex institutional projects over the years, including community centers, schools, museums, and libraries, to name a few. And all of them have one thing in common, that is washrooms. I've had the pleasure of laying out more toilets than I care to remember, and I'm excited by this new development in washroom design. It is certainly the future. Joining me is Joubert, an associate with Figurr. She's been an architect with a firm for over 20 years And we've worked together closely on all types of projects during that time for all types of clients. We can safely say that she too has worked on her fair share of public and private bathrooms.
So thank you, Stephen. Hello, everybody. Yeah, you're quite right. Toilets, as unremarkable as they may seem, they can provoke thought and exceptional experiences. So for example, a very small anecdote, when I was visiting Japan a few years ago, we went to see the movie Godzilla in a movie theater, and I needed to use the lavatories in the movie theater. So I went in the stall, and I was, wow, quite overwhelmed by the number of options and buttons to press, all in Japanese. So where was the flush button? Okay, of all of these options, I thought, okay, must be this really big button of the whole lot, maybe. So press it, and then no, that was the emergency button. Shoot, so two very nice and concerned employees came to my rescue. So washrooms, whether they're a hole in the ground or they are a multi-optional bidet, they are all linked to social and cultural taboos and habits. And we were actually quite surprised to see how much there is to study.
Recently at Figurr, many of our institutional clients are looking at how their washrooms are configured and how they can be improved. And so we've done quite a bit of research and have come up with some ideas on the subject. This is actually an interesting topic to dive into, even though it would not necessarily have been the first one to come to mind. But it's really not just about toilet stalls. It ends up being more about social interactions and how we perceive using the washroom. So today we'll cover four main topics: a brief history of public washrooms, what are the guiding principles of washrooms for all, what design challenges do we face during this process, and what are the solutions. Finally, we'll walk you through some current examples of washrooms for all in existing public spaces. To get started, let's review the flow of history for public washrooms. Historically, shared public toilets have been a feature of most communities, and this continues to be true in many countries. The earliest public toilets can be traced back to Roman times. Having invented the aqueduct, the Roman Empire had created one of the largest sewage systems the world had ever seen. It's understood that these public toilets were mostly for men, though some archaeologists believe they were co-ed. In this format, going to the washroom was a social event. It might seem like a nightmare in today's day and age, but back then, using the public toilet was a great opportunity to sit back and swap stories with those around you.
Now, the first gender segregated public washroom on record was a temporary setup at a Parisian ball in 1739. So let's not forget that people in court would, back then, would relieve themselves in the corner of a room or under a stair or wherever. It's not exactly the kind of house guests you would want today. So in the United States, in Massachusetts, passed a law in 1887 requiring workplaces that employed women to have restrooms for them. So by the 1920s, such laws were introduced, but it took many decades for it to become the norm in the Western world. And this format is how most of us experienced public washrooms until recently. And as more and more women entered the workforce, slowly but surely did the segregated washroom for women.
Beyond gender, accessibility is another factor that has restricted some people from being able to use public washrooms. The unisex accessible toilet stall was first established in the 1970s, as recently as that, primarily designed to accommodate someone in a wheelchair or someone who needs assistance to use the toilet.
So despite all these steps, despite all these steps. So according to a 2017 Statistics Canada study, among youth with disabilities ages 15 to 24, only 25% of those who needed adaptable washrooms at school reported that they were indeed made available to them. So we're talking only 25%. And while universal gender neutral washrooms have become more prevalent in recent years, they are still far from the norm. So given all we know, what does it mean to have washrooms for all? So the concept of washrooms for all means using design elements to eliminate discrimination based on a person's gender identity, mobility, or neurodiversity. So for example, urinals are commonplace in designated men's washrooms. However, this poses an issue for someone who is transitioning and chooses to use the men's washroom, or for someone with mobility concerns. They may have to wait for a stall to become available before being able to use the washroom, basically singling them out. In a truly universal space, removing the urinals and replacing them with stalls helps eliminate some of these roadblocks. But it's even more than that. So architects, designers, and policymakers, they have the opportunity to redefine the role of public washrooms in our society.
The concept of washrooms for all is a fairly recent idea. In 2015, a group named Stalled, based in the United States, was formed as a direct response to the moral panic triggered by court cases that guaranteed transgender individuals access to sex-segregated public toilets that align with their gender identity. Their group aims to study the issue of transgender persons' access to public washrooms and explore the cultural, political, and legal implications of the idea of washrooms for all. These principles served as the basis for our own integration of gender-inclusive washrooms in our projects. According to the advocacy group Stalled, there are four main principles that carry the design of washrooms for all and guide universal toilet design. First of all is the abolition of barriers. Whether the barriers are physical or emotional, sometimes using a public washroom can feel like moving through a maze. Imagine the frustration of being confronted with inaccessible stalls or negative feedback from other users. Universal washroom designs dispense with the wall that typically divides public space from the private bathroom. People can freely enter and exit the space from the main circulation path. No doors, no gender choices to make, stalls for everyone.
So the next principle is the abolition of the gender binary. So we already have many places where washrooms are gender neutral, like porta potties and outdoor events, and the washrooms in our own homes. The idea is that why can't this be a standard in our public spaces? In a washrooms for all design, no longer will people who don't fit the gender binary have to choose between two unacceptable options that don't align with their identity.
The third principle is accessibility and diversity. An ethical society that champions respect for human dignity and difference is based on creating universal and diverse public spaces. In washrooms, we must offer accessible stalls and family stalls within the same space. It is vital that we offer diverse spaces for different people with different needs.
And the final principle is creativity. Well, universal design can lead to invention. I'm sure many of you would agree. Well, sometimes our best ideas will come while we're in the washroom. But seriously, addressing the needs of all identities promises to be a catalyst for creativity that allows architects and designers to generate unforeseen solutions that have the potential to transform how all of us experience the built environment.
Okay, so let's discuss what these principles look like in practice when looking at the concept of washrooms for all. The universal washroom is based on several design choices from an architect's point of view. First of all is the removal of the wall, as we mentioned, separating the comfort station from the hallway. The universal washroom should be a natural extension of the hallway. No longer a closed space, it's a continuation of the circulation area, adding a sense of security. There's always a way out of the space with no barriers. Next is the removal of the dividing wall between the sanitary blocks to obtain a large open space. There's no separation between the men's, women's, or accessible areas. It's one space for all to use.
So next, we were talking about the diversification of the enclosures by including accessible stalls, as well as cabins with a sink and breastfeeding area with changing table to accommodate caregivers, can even go to religious practices and parents. So it's vital to offer many options to allow for diversity of use. And So the fourth is the wash basin area with mirrors at the edge of traffic. So this creates a buffer between the actual stalls themselves and the main circulation. Stalls are not directly on the main circulation path. So these wash basins allow to create a buffer zone. And finally, it's the lounge space. So this lounge space is dedicated to socialization that acts as a zone between corridor and the toilet block itself. It's the final buffer. It's limiting the isolation for the users and allowing people to wait for a friend or create a meeting point. So now let's now look at the common challenges and solutions in designing washrooms for all. How do we ensure that universal washrooms remain a safe space for all users? For example, the women's washrooms have long been understood as a safe space for women to socialize outside of sometimes, male-dominated areas. Women may feel uncomfortable with the idea of having a man using the toilet next to them or washing their hands beside them, and also vice versa. So during a recent experience we've had designing universal washrooms, we conducted several interviews and directed meetings with users for us to better understand what would refrain someone from using a genderless washroom. And the most frequently asked questions and concerns brought up by the users were noise transmission, odor control, security, and comfort. So we'll take a deeper look here at each one of those concerns.
Our first challenge revolves around sound transmission. How do we counter noise between stalls and the outside? This generally has to do with sound-related toilet use and flushing, as well as hand drying. We can balance this by incorporating floor-to-ceiling walls for better acoustic control, rather than using standard toilet partitions. An acoustic door on the stall will help alleviate these issues as well. We can also incorporate elements that generate less noise or help absorb sound for better acoustics, like installing a recycled paper dispenser rather than electric hand dryers.
The next concern is odor control. In an open, inclusive space, what can we do to limit odor transfer for both the washroom users and the surrounding public spaces? So the first and most obvious solution, which we talked a little bit earlier, is the removal of urinals, which are eliminated from universal washrooms. And they are a major source of odor in a standard layout, given that they're out in the open. So including automatic door closers ensure that stall doors will remain closed after use, limiting odor leaks. Another way to tackle this issue is through including sources of pleasant odors as a countermeasure. Air purifiers, deodorants, as well as many types of plants can also help overpower unwanted odors in the washroom. And lastly, the space's layout can also assist in this. So designing the space and surfaces for easy cleaning by staff will generate, in the end, fewer odors and less bacteria.
The next challenge we'll take a look at is security, which comes in many forms. This can include surface contamination, equipment safety, abuse or inappropriate use of equipment by users, vandalism, and even violence and harassment. We can help ensure a secure space using many methods. These would include video surveillance of the common areas, having the washroom open into the public space, allowing the security guard to patrol the premises, stall usage time monitoring that can send an alert to security staff if an enclosure has been used for too long. Eliminating main entrance and exit doors from the design allows users to gain a clear vision of others in the space and allows for continuous open circulation. Using motion sensor lighting, which is a safety measure, but also saves energy. Choosing robust equipment and surface coatings both discourages vandalism and facilitates cleaning.
So those first three challenges all factor into this final challenge, which is comfort. Everyone deserves to feel comfortable when using a public washroom, regardless of gender identity, accessibility requirements, or neurodiversity. But how do we do this? How do we create comfort in this very utilitarian space? The solutions to our previous challenges all contribute to an enjoyable experience using a public washroom. So noise control, odor control, security. But we can make this comfort truly universal using a few additional methods. So firstly, we can greatly reduce wait time, specifically for women. How many times have we been at an event and see long queues for the women's washroom, and all the while the men's washroom has no one in line? So having a non-gender specific area, it allows for better circulation flow and evening out the wait time for everyone. Ensuring inclusive infrastructure, so including items like the multiple accessible enclosures, changing tables for families, a rest area adjacent to the space. This all creates a comfortable atmosphere. And lastly, biophilia, which is, we're seeing this more and more, it connects users with nature. So the addition of green elements to projects, such as a green wall, well, it reduces stress, it promotes well-being, and it can also add an acoustical component to projects. So it becomes a focal point of the area.
So let's walk through a few practical examples of washrooms for all, showing how these principles are applied.
So the first example is a project we've taken on at the University of Montreal. The university has created an action plan that states its objectives for an inclusive living environment that is free of discrimination and is a representation of diversity in its community. So the washrooms for all concept, it fit very well into this plan. So we began work on universal washrooms that met the need for diversity to be reflected and respected in all day-to-day activities on campus. So this project was the first gender-neutral washroom project on their campus. So as we were working on the concept of washrooms for all with the university, we had to address three main obstacles in the planning of this project. So the three main were client preparation, was working with current infrastructure, and concerns from maintenance staff.
So firstly, change, as you know, is difficult for most people, and changing habits even more so when it comes to the most private of activities. Even if the university directors were on board with the project, preparing the users, staff, maintenance crew, and school unions was necessary and the key to successfully introduce a unique project like this. It is vital to ensure everyone is at the table and that we give solutions to their concerns to the best of our ability. We did this through several interviews, meetings, and presentations with all concerned parties, which was very helpful in educating everyone and addressing any major issues. We listened and we communicated. Everybody was heard, and that really was essential.
Our next obstacle was how we would adjust the current infrastructure to fit the project's needs. And working in an existing building, the structure, the plumbing, and other existing conditions, also like asbestos, can be major obstacles. And the washrooms for men and women, a bit like our example here, they can be located quite far apart from one another. So redirecting all the plumbing to centralized washrooms is one big common space is quite a roadblock if it's not well prepared. You'll have structural beams and rebars can also be problematic and restrictive space allowances. So as you can see here, where there's the X's and the red lining here, positioning by scanning the floors, it will determine where it's possible to actually drill and to avoid conflicts and ultimately unwanted costs. When you have a small space and very specific area to drill, it's really important to ensure that there are no concerns or obstacles. Our last major obstacle was with regards to cleanliness. So maintenance staff, they were worried that these washrooms would require more cleaning attention since each stall is an actual toilet with a closed door, which could lead to frequent overflows. Well, to address this concern to the best we could, we added floor drains to minimize these impacts. So at least it won't, there is a flood, water can go somewhere. There was a membranes over the existing slab for waterproofing. And we're using also very large ceramic tiles on the floor with fewer joints. This will facilitate cleaning and maintenance.
And here's another example of a washroom for all at a food court in Montreal, in a Montreal mall. I'm sure some of you have seen this. You can see walls instead of toilet partitions, doors with door closers, washable surfaces, and signage in the form of icons. Another example is a public school by Cunningham Architects. Again, we have the open corridor of flow circulation. Washing stations are adjacent to the main circulation path, and stalls have full walls and doors. At the risk of being repetitive, here's another example from the Montreal Science Museum. Once again, neutral colors, openness, no barriers, washing stations adjacent to main circulation area, full doors and walls instead of partitions.
So before we jump into our final thoughts and open the floor to questions, well, does anyone remember, I don't know, some might remember the gender neutral washroom in Ally McBeal's office. So that show started airing in 1997 and amplified a conversation about inclusive washrooms that we're still having today. It was such a new concept and almost an oddity, really, at the time. In some regards, it still is today. 26 years later, the conversation has not progressed really far enough. We're setting our sights towards the washroom as a more inclusive area, no longer reserved for TV shows.
In the end, what we are experiencing is a cultural shift. While no solution will please everybody, the idea of washrooms for all removes stigma from groups who once felt singled out. At Figurr, it's our responsibility as architects to ensure inclusivity in our design. Along with designers and policymakers, we have the opportunity to be a driving force in the cultural shift happening around us.
Alors, la culture des toilettes publiques change et ces projets seront de plus en plus demandés par nos clients. C'est à nous de bien se préparer, à préparer nos clients et surtout les usagers pour démystifier leur utilisation. Alors, merci pour votre attention. Thank you very much for this time given to us. And on pourra prendre les prochaines minutes pour des questions. Of course, if you have for questions, here we go.
Well, I'll tell you, when I joined Rotary, I didn't think I'd be sitting through a meeting talking about toilets, but there you go. I think there are 2 points that I want to make immediately before the hands go up. The first one is that we've all been through this at one time or another. And interestingly, the place that I've seen more women in a men's toilet than anywhere else has always been at Place des Arts and intermission time.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's amazing. It's just, you just go with the flow of all the places, you know. I find that very interesting. The other one that is very interesting is that you should know about is that the very first philanthropic work that the Rotary International did in 1907 was to supply a women's toilet outside of City Hall in Chicago.
No kidding.
That's the first thing that Rotary started as a group of gentlemen just chitting and chatting every week, and it didn't start off initially as a philanthropic thing, but a couple of years later, that is the first thing that they did.
So we're going to incorporate that into our presentation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it only took 127 years, 117 years, but we've made it to unisex. So I think it's a wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Jim,
Got some questions out here?
Jim,
Yes.
Merle.
Yeah, go ahead, Merle.
I don't have a question, but I do have a funny story to tell. Well, it's not funny. Okay, in 1960, I was promoted to Management Systems Development. I can't read my own writing here. This proved a problem for HR because when an employee is promoted to manager, they receive a key to the executive washroom. I was the first female to be promoted to manager. and couldn't use the executive washroom for obvious reasons. So I was given I was given a key to the washroom in the reception area, which was not available to employees. I resolved this issue, by using the washroom I had always used with regular friends of mine on the floor. It's come a long way from that. But I really enjoyed your presentation. But that's a funny anecdote.
That's interesting, yeah.
Funny that would have been a perk that somebody came up with some time, a long time ago. But then you get to have your own crapper.
Yeah.
I just, why exactly was this necessary? I do not know. I do not know.
Because it was in the 1960s, and women never got to be managers in 1960.
Yeah.
What is
Things are changing.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I have a comment.
Please do.
Jim?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. It was very interesting. I have, there's a feedback, okay?
Yeah, there's a bit of feedback.
Yeah. I went to school in Point Claire Village.
Hang on a second. That's going to be Merle's phone, I think. Merle, I'm going to mute you here. Right now.
Okay. I went to École Marguerite Bourgeois in Point Claire Village back in the 50s. And it was a French school run by the nuns. And we had these wonderful toilets. And they were big round sinks where we had to wash our hands, and to turn on the water, we stepped on the floor, on these floor things. So we didn't have to turn on the water. And I always thought they were quite amazing. And that was 60 years ago. And I often wondered what happened to those phenomenal sinks. And they just kind of disappeared. And here we are in 2023, kind of reinventing how to turn on water and how to use handless.
Touchless, yeah, handless, yeah.
Yeah. So that's my first comment, but I always thought they were rather intriguing. My second comment is, as architects, looking at this gender neutral, inclusive way to reinvent washrooms and what's going on in south of the border, I would imagine that you would be looking at a lot of backlash. And so this is a very unfortunate time to be looking at moving forward when things are moving backward. And so that's just my comment.
It's true.
We
Oh,
were
go ahead,
seeing that
Sue.
you have a very exclusive set of clients.
Yeah, I mean, and clients, it starts with the clients also. I mean, it's, we're not here to impose anything, but I think there is a discussion about it, especially in institutions like university schools. When we did this conference, it was a bit different, but very similar to the one we just did in Calgary a month ago. We met with a lot of people from East, like the Maritimes, and over there, they start earlier. They start, like, I think in actual elementary school level to introduce the concept and to introduce the notion of we're all together and people are different, and that's okay, and that's a normal thing of living in society, and everybody together. So it's and so they're starting earlier than we are here, actually. Then what happens south of the border is a bit different. I mean, I think there's different it's like it's so extreme on each side. So I think, yeah, it's a very interesting what's going on over there. But I think here, I'd like to think we're a bit different. And
What happened from the early 50s when we were able to have hands-free water, and then those things disappeared? And I was always kind of surprised that we were so advanced way back when I was in primary school with the nuns, with those wonderful sinks. And then
I remember them too. I went to school with nuns as well. And yeah, they are being removed quite a bit, eh, Stephen? I think it's you know, they'll introduce a common like a sink, a common sink usually, but they'll be handless. They'll be like automated. They're a bit different, and that's it's also in the sense where it's for accessibility, I believe, is also an issue that maybe not every child can pump, you know, if they're in a wheelchair or something. So I think that's also part of the shift. But I remember those sinks as well.
Another issue there, I think.
Considering it was 60 years ago. You know.
Another issue there too, I think, and you'll notice that, I think over the years, the maintenance people have had an impact. Those pedals were down on the floor, they've got to be clean. If you take a look at a lot of the pictures that Steve and Maud have shown us today, every single one of the toilets, every single one of the sinks are wide open and free. You go in there with a mop and you just, there's no working around. And even you see, when you see the rusted separators of stalls, because they get slopped with mops and that kind of thing. It's very, very difficult to maintain those things properly and keep them clean and sanitized. Mr. McCrae, you have something to say, sir?
Well, just
I have a question.
Were there building codes or rules that said you had to have gender-based washrooms, or is this just a practice that people built them that way? Or?
It's a combination of both. It's started off like that, and then it got incorporated into the codes by bureaucrats who decided that this is the way it has to go and this is the way it's going to be. So they even tell you how many stalls per number of people in the building or on the floor or in the, you know, in Place des Arts or whatever. They tell you, like, you know, 10 stalls for men, 10 stalls for women. Oh no, first of all, it was 10 stalls for men and 10 stalls for women. And then they realized, okay, that's not really, after many, many years, they realized that's not going to work because the women need more stalls. So they've been able to, in the code, separate it a little bit and say you can have more women than men, but it's still all very code regulation. And so what this is a little bit of a radical departure from that. And it's how we've interpreted. We've had these code experts actually working on this to interpret the code in such a way that it's a little looser. And so far, so good. No one's challenged it. And then the code in 5-10 years is going to catch up. There's no question about it. And it's going to be part of the code to have gender neutral, handicap accessible washrooms. And so that's where it's an interesting issue, especially among architects, that we have to find a way to make sure that we follow all the regulations at the same time.
David,
I have a question.
David, you had a question?
Let's do what Place des Arts. The washroom is used, of course, during the intermission, and they're quite long lineups. If there's a common, washroom, men and women will be lining up together in one line.
Right.
People might feel uncomfortable about that.
Well, the idea is that you'll have the stalls will be more used in the sense where, you know, in the men's, there are stalls that are not used during the lineup time, right? With the women. So yeah, it's a bit of an equity, let's say, kind of a thing, but maybe there'll be, because this is a very special situation where you'll have peak moments of use. And it's not to say that, I mean, Place des Arts, it's an existing condition. If they want to change their layouts, it could be, maybe they'll add a bit more also. I mean, that has to be, each case is a bit of you have to study each case kind of a thing. But it's, the idea is that if in the men's washroom, there's like 10 stalls that are just not being occupied because there's less men there. Well, the idea is that, okay, let's put, there's maybe 10 women that could be using them at the same time. So everything would go faster. But it's a change. It's not easy.
No.
Well, I think we've cleaned that up and pretty well flushed out all the questions.
No, you had to do that.
I'm sorry. This is what they pay me for, Steve. Thank you ever so much for informative and very entertaining presentation. It makes it shows part of the job that you have that can be very, very interesting and give you an opportunity to make dramatic changes in architecture.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that's very fulfilling in that sense.
True.
It is.
Thanks again, very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Yep.
And just go out there and keep building those walls.
Okay,
Thanks
nice.
for coming, Stephen.
Great seeing you all.